other archaeology. I'm doing prehistory. I'm doing Americanist influence and Americans in Israel doing prehistory, and the influence of prehistoric archaeology in Israel on Americans. This kind of reciprocal relationship between an American school, if you want, and prehistory here, especially Israeli, but not only. And the first thing that's interesting is that it's very, very late. American archaeology in Israel is very, very early. It goes back to the 1830s, biblical archaeology. And it moves on. And one of my problems is I actually have to pay attention to my slideshow. And you have very early archaeology here. It begins obviously with Napoleon. And we have biblical archaeology in Palestine. We have a lot of people doing a lot of archaeology very early. And prehistory is very early. Okay? Prehistory goes back to the 1920s. We have Buzi working in the Negev and Sinai in 1927, 1926. And we have Neuville. We have Garrett. This is the same slide that we just saw. And we've seen this picture as well. And so we have prehistoric archaeology here. We have archaeology in general very early, practiced by all the countries, Americans and Europeans. Then we have prehistoric archaeology practiced only by the Europeans, beginning much later. And it's, of course, interesting that it's so much later because it's quite early in Europe. But obviously that has to do with the presence of the imperial powers. There's an awareness of prehistory here. Americans are aware. Albright writes from the Stone Age to Christianity, and he relates to all the materials, especially to the Natufian, right? And very early on, we have Americans around the edges of prehistory. So McCown was an American. Hallam Movius, who later digs at Abri Plateau, digs in Sarakil with the American priests from Boston University, led by Ewing and Doherty. So there are Americans around the edges of prehistory, but they're not, there's no American presence in any massive sense. Yes, and here's Sarakil, and I was not able to find pictures of any of the priests. Well, by the way, obviously I'm not really working on archives here, but I am. Thinking about everything that we've been talking about today, the internet is now this incredible, biased, but incredible archive where we can find treasures. And you'll see some of them. And the first American project per se, which I'm not blocking anything, right? The first American project per se is that of Sally Binford. And Sally Binford comes to Israel in the early 1960s and begins to dig at Shubabik. Right? Shubabik, Shovach. It's part of the Mousterian project. She's writing her PhD. She's sent by Clark Howell. There's a connection, obviously, with Stekeles. Right? And she actually, and you can see this is stuff that's taken from the paper that she wrote in the Israel Exploration Journal in 1966. It's a really interesting paper because it's really archival. There's not even a bibliography. And at the end of the paper it says, "to be continued," which it never was, right? So it's a very, very interesting discussion where she basically gives a kind of precursor to the papers that she then writes on her own and with Lou Binford on the Mousterian. And you can see the Bordesian graphs where she's already dealing with Mousterian facies. However, she didn't have much influence. She came, she saw, and she didn't conquer. She was here for a very short time. She published a major paper. She published a paper in IEJ. Then went back to the States, went back to Chicago, went back to Berkeley, and married Lou. And then basically, my impression is she was the force behind the Mousterian debates. He was the charisma, but in terms of the thinking, and this would be really interesting archivally to check if there were stuff behind it. But I think she exposes him, Louis Binford, to the whole issue of Palestinian prehistory, of southern Levantine prehistory. Because in that book, New Perspectives in Archaeology, he writes a major paper which has major impact. He never comes here, but his influence is palpable. He writes post-Pleistocene adaptations, which becomes a major force in everything that we then did to try to work out the origins of agriculture. And if you haven't read the paper, I'm not sure it's worth it because it's really painful. But Ofer told me, by Yosef, that the reason he went to Sinai, at least partially, aside from going to Sinai, was to disprove the peripheral thesis that Binford presented. Okay? The first big project, the first big Americanist project that had a major impact was Art Jelinek's project at Tabun, the re-excavation of Garrett's project. All right? And I really don't have to go into the details of the methods, and I really do want to do this fast, but just to review a couple of things. First of all, he introduced detailed and just scattergun attribute analysis. So we all remember his graph in Science, where he demonstrates changing proportions of Levallois with time. Nobody had ever done that here before. The microstratigraphy that he introduced, describing every lens in Tabun becoming a separate context. And we all know Garrett dug by geological layers. And even Rust in Germany didn't dig with the precision that Jelinek did. No less important, he brought a bunch of people with him. This is the next generation. This is going through the archives, right? I couldn't find a young picture of Abraham. But what you have here is Harold Dibble, who wrote his PhD on materials from Tabun, and then became a major force, both influencing here, influencing elsewhere, and being influenced by here. Obviously, Gary Rollefson wrote his PhD on hand axes from Tabun, and then continues to work here and is always influenced by the work he did here. I think his influence on Israeli prehistory was less than Israeli prehistory's influence on him, but that's a different issue. And of course, Paul Goldberg having a very great impact, coming from University of Michigan and Bill Farron, and introducing environmental studies and site-based environmental studies in a way that hadn't really been done before. And of course, Abraham, who was a student at Tabun. So the influence of Americanist archaeology on this young student, now I couldn't find a picture of David Gilad either, but David Gilad also worked at Tabun as a doctoral student. So we have an influence of this American project on local Israelis, and we have the on local Israelis, and we have the influence of the science they did. And of course, this is Goldberg's sedimentology and his reconstruction, which Farron basically took. It was Goldberg's PhD. So that's one project. And the second project, I'm very proud of this picture because it captures Tony Mark's character. Sour. But of course, Tony comes here shortly afterwards in 1969, begins the Negev project, the Prehistory and Paleoenvironment Central Negev. It has tremendous influence. Okay? And I'll just mention a couple of the things, but he introduced refitting. And of course, he introduced refitting from two different perspectives. One, reconstruction of technology, and to this day, the 4-sequence technology at Boker Tachtit, showing the transition. Whether it's truly Levallois or not doesn't matter. He shows a technological transition from what let's call it quasi-Levallois, to single platform blade reduction was truly pioneering. And the other thing he does, which is really, of course, Harold Hayatala, is he does the spatial reconstructions. This is the first time in the southern Levant that we have not a distribution of lithics, but a distribution of conjoints, showing episodes of reduction. And of course, we all do that. Now it's common practice. And as with Jelinek, a whole series of people who then experienced archaeology here, impacted on archaeology here, and were impacted by archaeology here. And Danny Kaufman, obviously, but Don Henry, Alan Simmons, that's Harold Hayatala and Reed Ferring, and there were others, but these all had much greater impact on the way archaeology is done in Israel, bringing with them American perspectives. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about indirect influences, because Tony came from the Aswan Project, influenced by Wendorf, okay, influenced by Karl Butzer, very much, and of course Jim Phillips, coming from the Aswan Project, and then working with Ofer, and doing long-term projects, and bringing American and Americanist perspectives into the practice of archaeology in Israel. And then what I call the Bar Yosef connection, because Ofer starts out as French, remember. He starts out with the French connection without heroin. Yeah. and then does a sabbatical in Michigan, and then of course ends up in Harvard. And in that connects up with John Speth, Bob Whalen, and of course his very close friend Glenn Isaac, who actually he replaces at Harvard after Glenn tragically died in 1986. So Bar Yosef, who starts out very much influenced by his French experiences, then becomes influenced by a deep immersion in Americanist archaeology. But this is interesting. Ofer has never published a single paper in American antiquity, and he continuously said that it was a bad journal, which is interesting, but we won't go into that. Now, I have time, actually. I've been very good. Haven't I not done? I don't want to go into great detail. First of all, we're almost really short on time, but I do want to make a couple of comments summing this up. The first thing is that in the we really see the impact of international geopolitics on the practice of prehistory and the impact of schools of archaeological thought in the first half and the middle of the 20th century. Okay? You can actually identify differences in schools of, and the Americanist school was very much Binfordian, if you want. I don't think we can make those distinctions anymore. I don't think there's any way we can make those distinctions anymore. I don't think, when I look at my colleagues in France, they're doing very similar to things to what Americans are doing. There are differences in emphasis, but there are no real differences at the level of this is French archaeology, this is American archaeology, or this is British or German archaeology. Okay, that's the first point. The second point, which is also interesting, is that Israeli archaeology, and I'm talking about prehistory, right, not historical period archaeology, has always, as a result, been more cosmopolitan. It's taken from these different sources. We've been exposed to all these imperial forces, and as a result, what you get is what works. Now, I haven't gone through the next generation. In the paper, of course, but I didn't want to put my own picture up here, or my wife's picture, or Schuldenrein, you know, or all of these other people. But then there's a whole generation beyond the people that worked at Tabun and in the Negev, a whole generation that came right afterwards, for whom it's been a very reciprocal relationship. I don't think we can any longer talk about nationalist archaeologies, at least not in prehistory. Thanks.